Welcome to the 19th Century Novel Podcast, Episode 39, Natsume Sōseki, The Heredity of Taste, Part 1. I begin with an apology. A friend criticized me for my French pronunciation. I admit that my French is less Victor Hugo, more Inspector Clouseau. In addition, a professor of Japanese history pointed out that in my episodes on Nogi Kineshita's Pillar of Fire, I repeatedly mispronounced the name of a newspaper, calling it Hymen instead of Hayman. To these helpful critics I say merci and arigato, or perhaps that should be mercy and arigato. Unfortunately, I am woefully monolingual and must depend on the web to tell me how to pronounce foreign words. Whatever care I take with my pronunciation, I'm likely to commit further oral transgressions, especially as I consider Spanish, Italian, and Russian language novels in upcoming episodes. Again, I apologize to listeners with more sensitive ears and more sophisticated tongues. On a brighter note, I think I've pronounced most English language words correctly. Now, on to our episode. In 1904, the little-known 37-year-old Natsume Sōseki, who had for a decade worked as a middle and high school teacher and eventually as professor at Tokyo Imperial University, wrote these opening lines. I am a cat, and yet I have no name. After the publication of this novel, I Am a Cat, there followed a burst of inspiration that produced many short stories and novels, some written within mere weeks. In just 3 years, Sōseki would publish 8 novels and 2 short story collections, with another 6 novels appearing before his death in 1916. Sōseki is generally regarded as a key figure in modern Japanese literature. To John Nathan, no Japanese writer elevated the Japanese novel to the level of awareness that Sōseki achieved. To Eiko Aito and Graham Wilson, Sōseki is the best writer of prose to have emerged during the century since contact was re-established with the outside world in 1868. To Shuichi Kato, Sōseki's greatness is best appreciated not by considering any specific work, but rather the range of his talent. He seemed capable of writing almost anything and writing it brilliantly. And to Donald Keene, no writer is more highly esteemed by the Japanese than Natsume Sōseki. The vast majority of readers would surely name him as the greatest Japanese writer of modern times. This critical and popular consensus led in 1984 to Japan's replacing on the 1,000 yen bill Japan's first Prime Minister, Prince Ito, with Sōseki. Kato describes the range of Sōseki's accomplishments. He wrote about medieval Europe and middle school in provincial Japan. His style ranged from the most elegant and ornate to simple and lucid colloquial. He wrote trenchant satire and lyrical treatments of young love. And he wrote in that first burst of inspiration an anti-war novella, The Heredity of Taste, which was written in a remarkable 6 days in December 1905, which was published serially in January 1906 in the magazine Teikuku Bungaku, Imperial Literature, which has been translated twice into English in 1974 and 2004, yet which has been almost completely ignored by scholars, at least those writing in English. Like Nogi Kineshita, writing and serially publishing in 6 weeks Pillar of Fire just as the Russo-Japanese War was beginning, Sōseki was writing to the moment in December 1905, just 3 months after the end of the war, depicting its horrors realistically, almost journalistically, heightened by a brutally imaginative narrative, while conveying an elegiac sense of personal and national loss and trauma. a sensibility at odds with the more widespread triumphalist spirit that swept Japan. This spirit was not limited to Japan. The victory of an Asian nation over a Western one was celebrated in many parts of the non-Western world. Sammy, professor of history at the University of North Carolina, asserting that the war was celebrated by Asian and African intellectuals as a turning point in their critique of the Eurocentric world. Under the influence of the weather, the novel begins, even the gods lose their reason. Let's exterminate mankind, let's loose the ravenous dogs, was the cry that resounded from the heavens to the depths of the Sea of Japan and made it rage in all directions. This Shakespearean opening, mad gods against mad humans, as well as the invocation of Mark Antony's cry to let loose the dogs of war, would seem an attempt to elevate the war to the heroic level of tragedy and classical epic. That Sōseki draws from Shakespeare is no surprise, since he was well versed in the English literary tradition, having graduated with a degree in English literature, having spent 2 years studying in Britain, where he was tutored by James Craig, editor of the Ardent Shakespeare, and having received acclaim as a professor for his lectures on Macbeth. But Sōseki immediately undercuts the heroic tragedy of war in the next sentence. The cry penetrated as far as Manchuria. As soon as they heard it, the Japanese and the Russians responded by creating an immense slaughterhouse in the plains to the north of the continent of Asia, stretching over 400 kilometers. We've gone from the heavens to a measured distance in Manchuria. Sōseki then links the animalistic fury of a pack of wild dogs to the lethality of contemporary weapons. Under the skies, great hordes of ferocious dogs appeared and sped across the vast expanse. These four-legged bullets tore endlessly through the air, scenting fresh flesh. The mad gods exhort their dogs to devour the flesh, and the dogs without delay tore limbs to pieces with sinister crunching sounds. When all the human flesh has been consumed, the gods urge the dogs to go on to the bones and suck them dry. Created by demented gods, Sōseki writes, the dogs planted their fangs with brute force into the bones. The bones that the dogs did not manage to destroy were used to sharpen their fangs. In his account of infantry combat in the Russo-Japanese War, the combat veteran Tadayoshi Sakurai describes the onslaught of contemporary weaponry in similar terms. Thousands and thousands of shot and shell crossed in the air. The whole heaven and earth seemed the scene of the frantic rage of demons. Sōseki animates and makes horrific this demonic vision by suggesting a universe gone mad. There's no patriotism or even a motive displayed here. All is animalistic fury, bloodlust. It's not the world of a caustic feline observing farcical intellectuals, but of ferocious canines devouring human corpses. This passage ends with the narrator awakening from his dark vision to admit, half apologetically, I was lost in my accustomed reverie. As we'll see, the narrator, introverted, introspective, and bookish, is a thinly disguised version of Sōseki himself. He has come to a Tokyo train station to meet an arriving friend, but finds a large crowd has gathered, forcing him to wend his way, ironically, through a triumphal arch constructed to celebrate the nation's victory. As University of London history professor Now Akko Shimazu observes, the triumphal arch became yet another war symbol that dominated the national landscape in the immediate aftermath of the war, and in particular, those with classical European allegorical designs came to symbolize Japan's coming of age as a self-styled Western great power. Some in the crowd are wearing formal Western dress. Many are holding banners. Realizing that the crowd has gathered to welcome returning troops, the narrator tells himself, in a typical Sōsekian understatement, if they knew that I had imagined their loved ones as leftover dog food, it was safe to assume they would be annoyed. Although not caught up in this patriotic moment and this militarist glory, the narrator decides he'll watch the triumphal return of the soldiers, almost as a kind of sociological observation. Seeing Westerners in the crowd, though, he feels the pull of nationalism, telling himself that as a subject of the emperor, he really had to go and shout Banzai. This cry erupted on the platform and passed in a wave from one person to another until it came to him. These shouts pick up again when, giving a military salute, a general passes in front of him, a short man with a tanned face and sporting a salt and pepper beard, which perfectly describes General Nogi Marasuki, who had commanded the Japanese forces in the siege of Port Arthur. The narrator tells us he'd never once shouted Banzai, but now, compelled to do so, no sound came out of his mouth. Banzai remained stuck in his throat. The narrator puzzles through his temporary muteness. Banzai had started to rise from the depths of my throat, but the general had passed at the very moment it reached my mouth, and then I saw his tanned face, and his pepper and salt beard, and my Banzai was stillborn. Why? It's the appearance of the general that silences him. That is, it's when an abstract sentiment, patriotism, becomes concrete, becomes connected to a real person, an actual authority who promoted a deadly war, that the narrator goes silent. At that moment, he can't understand what's happened, but realizes that to understand something and identify the precise reason for it, we need to reflect calmly on the event after it has happened. It is only by going over the facts and analyzing them that we can arrive at an understanding of them. He concludes, Banzai had been blocked by something transcendent, beyond the scope of my right of intervention. At the same time as the Banzai was blocked, spasms difficult to describe shook my breast, and 2 tears rolled down my face. Thus, Sōseki reveals the narrator to be thoughtful and introspective, capable of analyzing his behavior rationally and seemingly dispassionately. But at the same time, the narrator responds with painful emotion, revealing himself to be alienated from both the patriotic crowd and from his own feelings about the war, a man who seems traumatized to the point of inertia and ignorance and emotional breakdown. With his wife, General Nogi, 6 years after his triumphal return, following the death of the emperor, would commit seppuku, ritual disembowelment, killing himself according to the samurai tradition of junshi, that is, to die with his lord. His suicide was also atonement for having lost the regimental colors to the enemy during the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. 35 years had passed since the Satsuma Rebellion, wrote Sōseki in 1916 in his novel Kokoro. By his own account, General Nogi had spent those 35 years yearning to die without finding the moment to do so. Which had been more excruciating for him, those 35 years of life, or the moment when he thrust the sword into his belly? This seppuku inspires the suicide of a character in the novel Kokoro, as atonement for the long-standing guilt he's felt about his responsibility for the death of a friend, also by suicide. Sōseki places this death in its precise cultural moment, the passing of the spirit of the Meiji era itself. Likewise, Nogi's suicide after the death of the emperor follows a samurai tradition that ended with the rise of Meiji Japan. But it's also atonement for the many deaths he was responsible for because of his strategy during the siege of Port Arthur, of repeated direct frontal assaults against well-defended enemy positions. In a poem he composed, we can hear his despair. Imperial troops, 1,000,000 strong, conquered the arrogant enemy, but siege and field warfare left a mountain of corpses. Ashamed, what face can I show old parents? How many men have returned this day of triumphal song? While Sōseki makes no mention of the war when discussing the general's suicide in Kokoro, he shows the war's impact on General Nogi in the Heredity of Taste. Those of us who were looking at the general for the first time had no way of drawing a comparison between what he had been before and what he was now. Presumably his wife and daughters, who had anxiously counted the days and nights, would be surprised by what they saw. War, when it does not kill people, ages them. The general was extremely thin, but perhaps his thinness was attributable to the cares he endured. The narrator admits he knows little about the true nature of war, identifying himself as belonging to the kind of people who live with their noses in books, like hermits withdrawn from the world, and knowing nothing of what is happening beyond their places of work. He reads newspaper accounts, but when there is a war, people like him do not genuinely feel as if it is really taking place. It's the general's appearance, this physical relic of the war, that face burned by the sun and that beard tinted with frost, which broaches his emotional distance. When these consequences had furtively passed in front of me, or more precisely, a fragment of the consequences, and moreover a living fragment, the narrator explains, I could see very clearly in my mind's eye the post-combat scenes on the plain of Manchuria. The narrator makes a similar point when viewing returning war veterans. Seeing how much the faces of those returning from the war differed from the faces of those who stayed in the city, I felt I understood it more acutely than ever before. I should point out that my summary of this novella necessarily flattens and simplifies the text, specifically its frequent digressions. Here is one such passage. All around that little fragment which we consider as an image of the war were the cheers of the people shouting Banzai. This was nothing more than the echo of the war cries that had resounded on the Manchurian battlefield. The meaning of Banzai, if we take the literal interpretation of the Chinese characters that comprise it, is, "May you live for 1,000 years." When a war cry sounds, on the other hand, its form and meaning differ singularly. The war cry is a short and simple "ah." Unlike Banzai, it has no particular meaning. But just because it has no meaning does not prevent it from having an extreme and deep significance. There are different kinds of human voices. Some are piercing, others harsh, some clear, some deep. The linguistic structures and inflections they express are equally varied. For 23 hours, 50 minutes of every 24 hours, people use words that have a precise meaning. Whatever domain, whatever field of knowledge or activity, whether it is clothing or food, negotiations or deals, greetings or trivial gossip, everything can be expressed vocally. Ultimately, it could even be argued that a domain does not exist if nobody is talking about it. But people do not usually utter sounds that make no sense and do not refer to a particular domain. In purely economic or utilitarian terms, however often we may utter a particular sound, we will be wasting our vocal energy if it has no recognizable meaning. Only in extreme situations are we forced to try to make ourselves understood through apparently meaningless sounds which needlessly assault the eardrums of innocent people. The war cry is a vocal distillation of the emotions of someone in a critical situation or threatened by danger. It is a natural cry of the deepest sincerity which rises straight up from the depths of the diaphragm, when a man, his whole body trembling, balances dangerously on a tensed metal wire, hovering between life and death, between this free world and hell. When someone yells, "Help!" the sincerity of his cry is clearly expressed in the word. The howl, "I am going to kill you," is clearly not without credibility, but precisely because the words have a meaning, the degree of certainty is reduced. As long as we retain sufficient discernment to use words that make sense, it cannot be said that we are uttering truth straight from the heart, unalloyed with anything else. This should give some indication of the digressive nature of Sōseki's prose in the Heredity of Taste, of how Sōseki is willing to interrupt a realistic narrative with an essayistic passage about the limits of language, a kind of preemptive acknowledgement perhaps of his own inability to fully capture the nature of war. The digression continues. Moreover, there is not the slightest crumb of humanity in a war cry. The war cry is "Aaagh!" In a war cry there is no sarcasm or common sense. It contains no good or evil. It is as devoid of falsehood as it is of any attempt to manipulate. It is from beginning to end only "Aaagh!" The emotion that it crystallizes, explodes, and sends out shock waves in all directions. That is what causes this "Aaagh!" to resonate. It has not that sense of sinister augury conveyed in expressions like Banzai, "Help!" or even "I am going to kill you." In other words, "Aaagh!" is mind, "Aaagh!" is soul, "Aaagh!" is humanity, "Aaagh!" is truth. And I think that it is only when we are able to hear this truth expressed simultaneously by tens, hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of people that we can appreciate the supreme, unfathomable, and infinite dimension of it. The fresh tears that rolled down my face when I saw the general were perhaps a reaction to this sense of supreme truth. A passage such as this is reminiscent of the often comically pedantic digressions that fill the pages of I Am a Cat. In these, Sōseki was influenced by the 18th century English novelist Laurence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, about which Sōseki said, "No other novel plays men for fools and clowns so extravagantly. No other novel makes us cry so hard or laugh so loud." But there's more than nonsense here. Unlike the infantry veteran Tadayoshi Sakurai, who recalled villagers giving him a great send-off when I left, they banzai'd me over and over again, making him determined not to go home again as a useless failure. Sōseki says that Banzai was nothing more than the echo of the war cries that had resounded on the Manchuria battlefield. He's pointing to the emptiness of patriotic cant. The real war cry, he argues, has no meaning. It's a truthful and immediate expression of emotional distress. Sōseki's argument strikingly prefigures Vietnam War veteran Tim O'Brien's assertion in his story How to Tell a True War Story that A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct, nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things they have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or if you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you have been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie. Likewise for Sōseki, there is not the slightest crumb of humanity in a war cry. The war cry is Aaagh! In a war cry there is no sarcasm or common sense. It contains no good or evil. It is as devoid of falsehood as it is of any attempt to manipulate. It is from beginning to end only Aaagh! Failing to say Banzai, the narrator also fails to gain another glance at the general. To fail to contemplate a representative of the vitality and energy that determined the destiny of the Japanese Empire, he says, was really a shame. After reading a passage like this, we're faced with the question of tone. This statement could be an honest expression of Sōseki's feelings about the general and what he represents. Or it could be meant as an expression of the narrator's feelings, suggesting that, for all of the similarities between author and narrator, they're not the same person. On this view, the narrator's comment may be read ironically. Sōseki's appreciation for 18th century satire would further such a reading. There's irony aplenty here. As described, the general hardly shows vitality and energy, and the notion that this man, or any man, can be seen as representing the empire's destiny seems false and naive, a kind of great man worship. While Nogi may have been lionized publicly after the war, according to James Fuji, professor of East Asian Studies at UC Irvine, Sōseki surely knew that the image of General Nogi associated with military valor, moral rectitude, and unflinching loyalty was at odds with the history of a soldier who had been suspended from the military on 3 different occasions, a man who had been dismissed from his post as governor of occupied Taiwan for administrative ineptitude, a general whose outdated strategies and intransigence caused the senseless slaughter of nearly 58,000 of his own men at the Battle of Port Arthur, won only after he was replaced by another commanding officer. In addition, what Nogi allegedly embodies, the grand destiny of the empire, is undercut by the narrator's juvenile-sounding expression that not seeing him again is really a shame. And then there's the impossibility of reconciling a war that Sōseki has described as an immense slaughterhouse created by demented gods with Japan's glorious destiny. Since we are aware of the narrator's intelligence and analytical skills, we want to believe he sees through this overwrought comment. But he's also uncertain and self-doubting and inexperienced, and seems to have been genuinely moved by the sight of this old man weathered by war. The nature of the irony in these comments, then, may not be so clear-cut, but may suggest some uncertainty in Sōseki, a tension between his respect for an honorable man who has suffered for his nation and the appropriation of the general as an emblem of imperial destiny. After its defeat of Russia, Japan occupied Manchuria, a territory which would become a model for the nation's overseas development, residential, agricultural, and industrial. The Treaty of Portsmouth, which formally ended the war, also gave control of Korea to Japan. Just what Sōseki's opinion was about this imperial expansion remains a matter of debate. Andrew Aaagh, professor of Japanese literature and culture at the University of Hawaii Manoa, argues that Sōseki was unable to resolve his conflicting views. His efforts to work through the social, economic, and cultural relations between Japanese center, Asian periphery, and European-derived civilization in public lectures and literary fiction, while at the same time presenting a skeptical view of Japan's externally imposed and oriented civilization. A recently discovered essay Sōseki published in a Manchurian newspaper after having visited there in 1909, an essay inspired by the assassination of Prince Ito in Manchuria by a Korean nationalist, would seem to make Sōseki's comment about the empire's destiny less ironic. In this essay, Sōseki sounds like a booster for Japan's Manchurian project, writing that overseas Japanese are all working with vigor and good cheer, unlike the depression and neurasthenia, despair and discontent which have infected the population everywhere in Japan, and these compatriots are engaged in all manner of civilizing efforts and achieving clear dominance. There's no irony intended here, no questioning of a civilizing effort that requires dominance. More than praise for this imperial project, Sōseki embraces the kind of ethno-nationalism that was a defining feature of Japanese imperialism, saying, "I had finally become aware just how fortunate I was to have been born Japanese, and I was glad not to have been born Chinese or Korean," reinforcing what the narrator refers to as a Japanese vitality and energy that determine the destiny of the empire. Sōseki in this essay praises the overseas Japanese, who approach all endeavors with the resolve of victors, and who really must be regarded as the blessed children of fate, unlike the resident Japanese, whom he sees as victims of a Western-generated neurasthenia. While the evidence from this essay makes a compelling argument for Sōseki's sympathy for the empire, it should be remembered, 1, that he wrote this essay nearly 4 years after the Heredity of Taste, after his visceral reaction to the horrors of the war had receded. 2, that his opinions about Imperial Japan were inconsistent and cannot be determined by one essay. And 3, that I can only rely on those of his writings which have been translated into English. However, there's no doubt about, no irony in, the narrator's appreciation for the soldiers he sees, who have returned from the front. These soldiers, seemingly common men, represent the best of Japan. Businessmen are useless to the nation, the narrator declares, as are journalists and geishas. And of course, people like me who spend their lives with their noses in books. Tadayoshi Sakurai, in his autobiographical account of war in Manchuria, explains that some of the men he served with were so poor that their wives and children seemed likely to starve without them. Likewise, the historian Shimazu argues that military service often harmed the families left behind, since the meager provisions that the state provided to families of soldiers could not possibly sustain a young family deprived of its breadwinner. According to Shimazu, many expressed their guilt about leaving behind their aging parents to fend for themselves, especially those who came from economically deprived backgrounds. To Sōseki, these soldiers in their faded uniforms and long beards, although they might be mistaken for tramps, represent not only the spirit of Japan, but more than that, they embody a spirit common to all humanity. They are worthy of respect because of the mental discipline that urged these men to the limits of their endurance, that drove them to advance with authority. These traits are alien to the narrator and likely to the often sickly and disablingly analytical Sōseki. While admiring these heroic soldiers, the narrator sees one man with fine and elegant lines in his face who bears a striking resemblance to his friend Kosan, an infantry lieutenant who died on the field of honor at Port Arthur. For a moment, the narrator wishes his deceased friend and this survivor of the war could trade places, until he sees this man greeted by his mother as if she'd found a long-lost child. He watches them walk off together, arm in arm, to cheers of Banzai, concluding the novel's opening section. This musical interlude consists of the song Batotai, the Drawn Sword Regiment, the music composed in 1877 by the Frenchman Charles Leroux, who as part of a French military advisory group served as bandmaster of the Imperial Japanese Army Band. The Japanese relied on French military advisors until their humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, after which the Japanese sought military advice from the victorious Germans. The song's lyrics refer to a battle from the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, a struggle between disaffected samurai and the government. The lyrics are as follows: "We are the government troops, and our enemies are the emperor's enemies, forsaken by heaven and earth. The enemy's commander is one who through history has no equal, a hero. The soldiers who follow him are united as fierce warriors ready to fight to the death. Though the wrathful deities shake their courage not, heaven will not forgive their rebellion. Those who have risen against us since olden times have never had their moment of glory. Until that time that our enemy is destroyed, charge together as one, drawing our swords glistening like a broken jewel, we must charge forth, determined to die. Our divine nation's ways and the samurai's bodies were defended by the spirits. Though thrown away after the restoration, our Japanese swords now and again may be carried. Again in our era, our reputation returned. Enemy and ally together as one must die under the edge of the blade. And to those with the Yamato spirit, the time to die is now. Do not disgrace yourself with delay. The sentiment expressed in this song, soldiers imbued with the Yamato, i.e., Japanese spirit, and willing to die for the emperor, was shared by many Japanese troops in the Russo-Japanese War, but was a belief that Sōseki's depiction of the war renders naive and mistaken. The next section of the story begins with a simple declaration of Kosan's fate. He died at Port Arthur in November of last year during the assault on the Sungshushan fortress. Port Arthur, now the Chinese city of Dalian, population 7 million, which sits on a peninsula just west of North Korea, was a much smaller town of 56,000, occupied by Russia, a warm water port linked to the Trans-Siberian Railway. The historians Dennis and Peggy Warner paint a picture of the town. The narrow entrance of the harbor opened into a handsome landlocked bay with bare, rugged hills rising sharply on all sides. The town nestled below the surrounding hills, with a line of white-painted houses and gray-roofed workshops stretching along the waterfront. During the war, much of the surviving Russian fleet was trapped in the harbor by the Japanese Navy, with the town surrounded by Japanese Army troops who laid siege from August 1904 to January 1905. The Russian defenders consisted of 41,899 men, with 506 guns, many of whom were situated in elaborately fortified positions in the hills surrounding the city. The Japanese attackers consisted of 80,000 troops with 474 guns, including, writes the military historian Michael Clodfelter, 18 11-inch howitzers that could hurl a 550-pound shell 10,000 yards. During the course of the 11-month siege, the Japanese artillery would fire some 1.5 million shells. Much of this artillery barrage was coordinated with 3 large-scale assaults General Nogi ordered against Russian troops in forts and trenches carved into the hills, resulting in more than 30,000 Japanese casualties. Dennis and Peggy Warner set the scene for these assaults. Caves had been built into many of the hills. The Russians had installed landmines, thicker concrete walls around the forts, and electric fences and booby traps. One of these, a contraption made of planks of wood with 5-inch nails sticking out, an early version of the punji sticks used 60 years later by the Viet Cong, was particularly effective against the Japanese in their straw sandals. Tadayoshi Sakurai describes the suicidal nature of the attacks against these Russian fortifications as shooting off human beings, attacking with bullets of human flesh. The assault on November 26, which led to Kosan's death, the 4th general assault in 4 months, the narrator reports, began at 1 o'clock in the afternoon when the soldiers in their hundreds, it was impossible to estimate the number, immediately left their trenches and began the attack. The narrator describes the attacking Japanese soldiers as like ants when someone has kicked their nest, swarming up the mountain in front of the fortress. This is a familiar enough image. The Warners, for instance, describe the Japanese swarming like ants over hillsides and the Russian infantry blazing at them, killing them by hundreds. What's different about Sōseki's account is not his use of metaphor, but his use of a distant observer. From where I stood, the narrator tells us, it looked as if a black river was flowing straight up the hill and cutting it in two. The enemy shells crashed mercilessly in the midst of this black flowing mass. When the smoke cleared, I saw that the black creatures were continuing to swarm and squirm past, just as before Kosan was among them. Exactly who is this I observing the attack from a distance? The only possibility is that it's the unnamed first-person narrator. But that's a problem since, as we've already seen, this man has no personal experience of the war, even from a distance. He was not a soldier in Manchuria or even a journalist observer. This view of the war, of the brutal attack that will cause the death of Kosan, must be the narrator's imaginative reconstruction. He describes in precise detail what took place on a Manchurian hillside on November 26, 1905. Clodfelter gives a succinct account of this attack and its aftermath. Another massive attack on November 26 to the 27th succeeded only in carpeting the ground in front of the Russian defenses with the dead or wounded bodies of 12,000 Japanese soldiers. At Sungshu Fort, 1,000 Japanese out of a force of 2,600 fell on the night of November 26th. A ceasefire to collect the wounded the next morning brought no survivors back on stretchers. The wounded had all frozen to death during the night. Sōseki offers more details, describing soldiers climbing through openings cut in barbed wire, and while under fire, carrying bags of soil which they planned to fill and ladders with which they hoped to cross deep ditches, but which were too short to be of much use. Two things stand out about Sōseki's description of this combat. First, it's all seen from a distance, an extreme long shot. This kind of panoramic view was available to soldiers on the steep hillside surrounding Port Arthur, as the combat veteran Sakurai describes. We could see through the mist the forts on a faraway mountain and ramparts on nearer hills and peaks, and imagine that soon the curtain would be raised and a great living drama again be presented on the stage. Given that the narrator is not on the scene, and thus can depict the combat however he chooses, from afar or up close, we should ask why Sōseki maintains this distance. For one thing, it depersonalizes just as war does, rendering the soldiers an undifferentiated mass. This distancing serves in some ways to protect the narrator from the grim reality of his friend's death. This distance also keeps the narrator from having to depict the incalculable horrors of combat which may exceed his imagination. It also places Kosan's death within the context of a large-scale assault in which nearly 40% of the attacking troops were killed. As before, Sōseki here uses a common metaphor. The troops look like ants, but transforms it through repetition and variation, as in these passages. Kosan was squirming like an ant on the end of a pickaxe that someone has used to dig up an anthill and destroy it. He was squirming like a baby spider trapped by the water from a long ladle. He became as insignificant as a grain of soya in a straw bag. Sometimes the mass began to move again, like a snake crawling over a wall, each part of its body along its whole length wriggling frantically. Through the gaps in the curling smoke, we could see something at the head of the black snake. Suddenly, part of the snake's head was severed and disappeared from sight. The other members of his detachment that I had seen squirming like river snails had disappeared too. After squirming about like a mass of tadpoles, they had dropped suddenly into that bottomless pit. This taxonomy depersonalizes and dehumanizes. The many animals Sōseki refers to in this story, wild dogs, lines of black ants, a crawling snake, squirming snails, a mass of tadpoles, remove these men's humanity and reinforce the brutishness of war. Although the battle is seen from a distance, the narrator is able to follow the slow advance of Kosan by making him visibly prominent as a flag bearer. Was it the power of the wind or human action that made the bearer fall back down the mountain? Whatever it was, he fell sharply, but I thought that I would see him stand upright again in front of me. As I became dismayed and wondered whether he had fallen for good, he rose again and reached towards the sky. I was convinced that I would be able to make out what was happening if the smoke dispersed, and what I would see would be Kosan's flag on the other side of the ditch, which would flutter in the sun and reflect the light. I was in no doubt of that, nor that he would have climbed up high on the other side of the ditch, and that I would see the Japanese flag on the parapet of the fort, floating high in the air and flapping in the wind. With Kosan on the scene, you knew that something like that would happen. But we saw no sign of any human being. Alas, that was strange. The flag should already have been on its way moving forward. By then Kosan should have been halfway up the mound of earth below the wall of the stronghold. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then 30 seconds, and all in vain. No soldier came out of the ditch to continue to advance. And this did not change. Those who had jumped into the trench had not done so to cross it and climb up the other side. They had jumped in to die there. As soon as their feet had touched the bottom of the pit, machine guns, which had been trained on the trench, awaiting their arrival, opened fire on them. They transferred the soldiers from life to death in the blink of an eye. For a less figurative and closer description of the assault, one might want to seek out contemporary journalistic narratives, except that this reporting faced severe press restrictions. Here, for instance, is the Reuters news agency's account of the assault. It is reported that the Japanese saps directed against the Erhongshan, Sungshu-shan, and East Kikwan-shan forts have reached the base of the center ditches. The passageways of the Erhongshan and Sungshu-shan forts have been captured, leaving the Russians in possession of the parapets. The Japanese guns are shelling the latter and inflicting heavy damage. The occupation of these forts is expected shortly, and if they are taken, the capture of Port Arthur proper at no long interval seems assured. The Reuters correspondent Willard Straight explained that the Japanese wooed reporters while at the same time restricting coverage. A government holding the rabid pressmen at a distance, censoring their simplest stories, yet patting them on the back, dining them, giving them picnics and luncheons, and trying in every way to deaden their sense of duty and their desire to get in the field. Among the correspondents seeking to cover the war and thereby cover himself in glory was Jack London, who by this time was the well-known author of The Call of the Wild and The Sea Wolf, and who had been hired as a correspondent by the Hearst newspapers. Remembering newspaper accounts of the siege of Khartoum and Stephen Crane's reporting from Cuba during the Spanish-American War, London looked forward to the thrill of combat reporting, admitting, "I entered upon this campaign with the most gorgeous conceptions of what a war correspondent's work in the world must be. I had heard of all sorts and conditions of correspondence in all sorts of battles and skirmishes, right in the thick of it, where life was keen and immortal moments were being lived." London managed to get to Korea by chartering a native fishing junk and riding 200 miles on horseback with an interpreter, cook, and 2 grooms to look after their horses, ultimately crossing the Yalu River into Manchuria and reporting on a skirmish between Japanese troops and a small party of Cossacks. Later, he reported on the Battle of the Yalu, which Robert Kauner, professor of Japanese history and culture at the University of Haifa, Israel, calls the first major land engagement between Russian and Japanese forces during the Russo-Japanese War. But this account was based wholly on second-hand information from the Japanese military. Unable to reach the front, where life was keen and immortal moments were being lived, a disappointed London soon thereafter returned to San Francisco. London and the other journalists were victims of Japan's tight-fisted control of information. As Michael Sweeney, professor of communications at Utah State University, and Natasha Toft-Rolsgaard, professor of journalism at Muskingum University in Concord, Ohio, assert, virtually overnight, it seemed the rules had changed, and they had changed dramatically. Japan walled off war correspondents from the news, keeping them figuratively blind, deaf, and mute. This press censorship introduced what would become, until the advent of social media, the techniques used to control journalists during wartime: written regulations, press pools, military minders, and censorship. One American military attaché, in a 1905 report to the War Department, praised the way in which Japan has handled the question of the censorship. There can be no doubt that the standard set in this war has furnished an object lesson which will be presented to all the great powers by their attachés in the field in such a way as to make some similar method a necessity in all future wars. Against this backdrop of information control and nationalist celebration, we should appreciate the brutal honesty of Sōseki's account. Having seen, or rather having vividly and accurately imagined, swarms of advancing Japanese soldiers disappearing, the narrator concludes, it was absurd to expect people who were lying in a deep ditch, piled one on top of the other like pieces of fat radish preserved in brine, to follow the simple order that had been given them and climb up the other side. The erasure of humanity conveyed by this image was reflected on the battlefield. The military historian Richard Connaughton describes how the bodies of the charging Japanese became human sandbags. The Russian machine guns scythed through the ranks while the attackers on the granite slopes below built parapets out of their dead and wounded. The Japanese launched occasional attacks, which were stopped while their dead were rolled backwards down the hill to join the parapet. Great boulders were launched from the hilltop by the Russians to break down the lifeless human wall. Sōseki's image, corpses compared to pieces of preserved radishes, removes all individuality, all humanity from the deceased, just as the war did to these men. Even now, with our post-Holocaust familiarity with images of mass graves, the grossness of Sōseki's metaphor retains a defamiliarizing power. He continues his description of these corpses in a passage remarkable for its time that has no element of heroism or romance or patriotism or sacrifice or glory, but instead presents matter-of-factly the battle's grim catalogue. However much a man wanted to climb out, if his limbs would not move, it could not be done. If his eyes were growing dim, he could not climb. If he had a hole in his chest, he could not climb. If his blood did not circulate, if his brain was crushed, if his shoulder was wrenched out, if his body stiffened like a walking stick, he could not climb. It was not just when the smoke from the guns of the Heilongjiang fortress had cleared that he could no longer climb. It would be so, too, when the cold sun of Port Arthur had sunk into the sea and frost again covered the surrounding mountains, that it would be impossible to climb. The veteran Sakurai is equally graphic in his depiction of the consequences of combat, describing what it was like to stand in the same corpse-strewn trench. The dead and wounded were piled one upon another in nooks and corners, some groaning with pain, some crying for help, and some perfectly quiet, breathing no longer. We hardly found space to walk without stepping on them. Where we stepped, thinking it was on Mother Earth, we found ourselves walking over the khaki-colored corpses. At that very moment I was treading on the chest of one. "Pardon," was the only apology I could offer the dead thus unintentionally insulted. We looked for the dead and wounded in the dark and found their condition still worse and more miserable than before, because the artillerymen had been through the same place after us, and many dead and dying had been run over by the gun carriages. Those who had been breathing faintly had breathed their last under the iron wheels. Those who had already died were cut to pieces. Shattered bones, torn flesh, flowing blood were mingled with broken swords and split rifles. While Sakurai's description is if anything more graphic than Sōseki's, his account is saved from meaningless horror by his belief in heroic sacrifice. To die under the flying flag of the rising sun, and to die while doing splendid service to one's country, he writes, was the wish and resolve of every heart. Every heart? In writing for a popular audience, Sakurai is presenting what the public expected of Japanese soldiers, that they would willingly sacrifice themselves for emperor and nation. Shimazu, on the contrary, argues that many soldiers, especially those who had been conscripted into the military, gave lip service to the notion of an honorable war death. These men, she writes, knew from first-hand experience the tragic reality of battlefield death, and were not taken in by the rhetoric. Port Arthur would finally fall to the Japanese on January 2, 1905. Roten Kohner provides the grim final tally. The Japanese army suffered the greatest losses in the war, 81,280 dead, of whom 60,083 died in action, and 21,197 died of disease. The Russians lost 71,453 men, of whom 52,800 were killed or died of wounds, and 18,830 died of disease. One Japanese soldier remembered the disturbing reality behind these numbers. "We had to go and bury the remains of the enemy war dead, which were already buried once, but had been dug out by dogs and birds. They were buried like potatoes with heads lined up, but it was so smelly that my nose was about to fall off. In any case, eyes had fallen out, and there were just holes. It was a real problem trying to cover them with soil as it smelt so bad. We buried about 8 or 9 persons in one hole. We came back, washed our hands with a bit of water, and then had dinner and went to bed."
For a transcript of this episode, along with the bibliography and other materials, please go to 19thCenturyNovel.podbean.com.